Welcome everyone to Philoxenia Online, a talk by Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna. As usual at the moment, we are unfortunately not in Vienna and not in Kreisky's living room and in sort of welcoming our guests. We are on a Zoom talk between Vienna and London, and I'm very, very happy to welcome my guest for tonight, Noreena Hertz. Welcome, Noreena.
Thank you, Tessa, for inviting me.
This is a very special moment, actually, because Noreena is very well known here in Britain, but she's also well known already in European countries. But her latest book, which we will discuss tonight, has just been published in German today at HarperCollins. It's called in German, like the English version was The Lonely Century. In German, it's Das Zeitalter der Einsamkeit. And we will have a look what her, not only her analysis of loneliness as one of the most dangerous diseases for our soul and our bodies are about, but also which proposals you, Noreena, have to minimize it, to rein it in, and to make the post-pandemic globe easier to live on without that amount of loneliness which people have experienced in this last year. So first of all, welcome to you. And welcome also to all of our listeners that are now assembling on this Zoom talk, but also on Facebook Live. Let me say from the beginning that we will have a conversation between the two of us at the beginning, but both of us very much invite questions from the audience. If you are on Zoom with us in the Zoom room, please make yourself heard. In a virtual sense, you can raise the yellow little hand that is on the bottom of the Zoom window. But you can also write into the chat that you have a question. If you are on Facebook listening to us, you cannot directly ask a question, but you can also type it in the chat. And Jutta in the tech room in Kreisky Forum will be able to collect questions and ask them. So that's for starters. Now let me introduce Noreena properly. Noreena, you're an honorary professor at the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College in London since 2014. You have afterwards already been economic editor at the British TV channel ITV. You give keynote speeches at the World Economic Forum in Davos. You hold TED Talks. You publish articles about your numerous subjects as an economist and as an author in the Financial Times or The Guardian and plenty of other English-speaking media. What is amazing for me is that when I looked at your the list of the books you authored so far, that for the past 20 years, you've basically always been a little bit ahead of the curve in finding out what we best should think about if we want to avoid the next disaster. So for example, in 2001, you wrote a book called The Silent Takeover, where you were talking about unregulated capitalism and its dangers for democracy. This was just 6 years before the financial crisis hit all of us and made us all experts in banking and its dangers. So chapeau for that. You also, in 2000, Eyes Wider Open. And it was about, it was basically a handbook for critical thinking in the digital age. Also at the time when we just started to begin to understand what Facebook and these very, very powerful, huge companies were doing with our democratic rights and our and how much they endangered also our ways of communication. In 2015, you wrote So it goes basically on and on. And I thought it was not a big surprise that the business magazine Fast Company once wrote that you're always ahead of your time and that your prognosis is usually accurate. So that's a very good starting point for our conversation, which is about your book, The Lonely Century. You describe in this book, which you start research before the corona pandemic hit, enormous amount of loneliness that has been spread over the populations in all different countries on this globe. So maybe in order to open this discussion, I would like to ask you if you feel that this debate in the last year on loneliness has changed the outlook of governments on this problem, because it has been there before, but now it is so obvious to everyone, even to people who usually are not lonely, that lockdowns make people a lot lonelier.
Yeah, I think it is really important to emphasize, though, Tessa, that it really was a serious problem even before the pandemic. In 2017, 2/3 of Germans said that they thought loneliness was a serious problem. 2/5 of Swiss in 2019 said that they felt lonely often, sometimes, or always. In the United States, 1 in 5 millennials said in 2019 that they didn't have a single friend. So even before the pandemic struck, loneliness was a real problem. Of course, you're absolutely right. The pandemic has massively accelerated this and is putting loneliness on politicians' radars in a way that it, in many cases, wasn't before. And it's been interesting to actually hear politicians in recent weeks, actually talk about loneliness quite explicitly. And I've noticed it in some of Boris Johnson's speeches. I've even noted Biden mentioning loneliness. So, so governments are starting to acknowledge that we are in the midst of a very acute loneliness situation, one which we definitely need to address. But my hope is that they realize that its drivers, were not just the pandemic, but in fact were a whole host of structural drivers way before the pandemic even struck, got us to a situation where so many people amongst us were feeling lonely, period.
So what would you say are these drivers? What are the things that we have to look to in order also to find ways of dealing with it and change it? What are the most important things?
Yeah, so a number of factors that have been at play, really. So firstly, we just do less with each other than we did in the past. So people are less likely to go to church. They're less likely to be a member of a trade union. They're less likely to be a member of a parent-teachers association at a school. More people live on their own. People are less likely to eat together. So part of it are these kind of social and demographic changes, some of which are inexorably linked, of course, to politics and economics as well. So some of it is just we do less with each other. Also at play is, of course, as I found out very clearly our smartphones. I was quite agnostic, really, before I began my research about the role that smartphones did play in the contemporary loneliness crisis. And I wanted to look at it, really, really dig into the evidence and work out whether or not it did play a role. And so I really dug into the academic literature, but also interviewed many teenagers. And I've come away from a few years of research on it, feeling very clear that our smartphones and social media are playing a role. Partly it's just our smartphones. They keep us, well, because of what's on them, not only social media, but also emails, they are these devices which keep us perma-connected in some ways, but also perma-distracted. And importantly, make us not present with those physically around us. So, you know, I'm sure, well, I've definitely been guilty of it. Maybe you haven't, Tessa, but, you know, been in a room with a friend or a loved one and your head really in your phone, not really even seeing them or hearing them. Of course, that's going to make people feel lonely. But social media playing a distinct role in why we've become so lonely. Something that we know now empirically, because until about 2019, we had seen a correlation between rising levels of social media usage and rising levels of loneliness, but it was hard to definitively establish a causal link. But what we saw in 2019 was a very big study undertaken at Stanford University, where 1,500 students were the control group. They were charged with using Facebook as usual, and the other 1,500 were in the study were told to stop using Facebook for 2 months. And the results were very unambiguous. The group who stopped using Facebook spent significantly more time doing things in person with others. We know that in-person, face-to-face interactions are higher quality. They also felt significantly happier and significantly less lonely. And part of the reason social media does make people feel lonely is firstly the quality of the interaction can be really quite toxic. In the United Kingdom, 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-old women have experienced abuse on Facebook. Of course, it can make people feel lonely because even if you haven't directly experienced abuse, just witnessing this kind of toxicity can make you feel quite disconnected from your fellow citizens. But it also makes people feel lonely, especially the young, because it can be, it's easy to just look on your feeds and think everyone else is more popular than me.
Yeah.
Everyone's got more friends than me. Everyone's got more likes than me. Everyone's got more retweets than me. Yeah, so this is just two of the reasons.
Come in there for a second, because one of the things in the pandemic that I was actually also in a way happy about is that my 16-year-old son, who couldn't go to school for months and was on remote learning, distance schoolings, at least had his phone to communicate with his friends. So in a sense, of course, there's also a positive effect of being connected via social media if you, at the moment like this, cannot have any physical face-to-face meetings. I mean, shouldn't we also take this into consideration when we, condemn the smartphones, our beloved smartphones?
So, I mean, of course, during this past year, we have all been very grateful for technology, very grateful that we can be doing this. I would love to be in Vienna right now, but I'm very grateful that we're able to do this on Zoom. And of course, being on our phones, connecting with people on WhatsApp groups, being able to connect on social media to relatives abroad and friends has been really important. But net, I think the evidence is clear that net social media is net destructive. And actually a study just came out the other week, which was tracking loneliness amongst young people during this pandemic. And they found that, again, it's hard to establish whether it's correlation or causation, but there was a clear link between the amount of time teenagers were spending on their phones and how lonely they felt. So loneliness isn't abated, we know, by being on your devices. And speaking to teenagers, interviewing them, their stories were very moving about how Peter, this 14-year-old boy, telling me about how he would post on Instagram and be waiting for somebody to like his posts. And when they didn't, asking himself, what am I doing wrong? And saying he felt so invisible. Or Claudia, whose friends had told her that they were not going out after school, and then she was on her feeds and she saw them hanging out without her, and she said, I felt so excluded and I hung out in my room for a week. So I found this testimony is pretty compelling as well amongst that age group, especially.
Of course, you have always sort of, teenagers in particularly, they're so vulnerable, probably more vulnerable than any other group. And interestingly, you also say that it's the loneliness problem during the pandemic was not, the biggest problem was not the old people in the care homes, our parents and grandparents who were sort of basically locked away for a while, but that especially teenagers,
yes,
unemployed, and women became more lonely throughout the pandemic. So we have to look at all these different groups under a new light, probably, in terms also how to treat loneliness with them.
Yes, and pre-pandemic, and this wasn't obvious until I began my research. Pre-pandemic, the loneliest group was actually not the elderly, who we think of as typically being the loneliest, but the young. And then the young is one of the groups, one of the three groups who have become disproportionately lonelier during the pandemic. Everyone's become lonelier, on average. Around 50% of the population in most countries are now ticking that they feel lonely. So, but some groups have become disproportionately lonelier. And you're right, any policy recommendations need to be quite granular and recognize, and also recognizing, this is important to communicate as well, that loneliness isn't just about feeling a craving for intimacy or companionship, or a feeling of feeling disconnected from your friends and family, but it's also something more existential. It's a feeling of being disconnected from your fellow citizens, from your government, from your employer, a sense of being invisible and unheard, not only when you're talking about kind of your supposed nearest and dearest, but also in terms of vis-a-vis the state and the workplace. So, that is how I define loneliness. And I think it is an appropriate way of thinking about loneliness. And again, it begets kind of particular policy responses for sure.
Well, what you say in your book, which is the main thing, is that the loneliness is not just a sad feeling for a while. It sort of makes you actually sick. It makes your soul sick. It makes your body sick, and therefore it also has an effect on your work, on your productivity, on your outlook on life, and it harms our economies. That's why we have to take it seriously.
Yes, loneliness is bad for our health, physical as well as mental. Loneliness is as bad for our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which is quite astounding. It's bad for our wealth. It's bad for our economy. Lonely workers are less productive, less motivated, more likely to quit a company. And it's also bad for our democracy. And that's something that I look at kind of in my book. In fact, it was one of the motivations for writing my book was the research I was doing on the rise of right-wing populism across the globe. And I discovered that loneliness was a thread, a common thread amongst the people whose testimonies I was hearing and interviewing. A sense of being lonely, like really lacking friends, lacking a support network, but also a sense of feeling invisible and unheard and profoundly disconnected from traditional political parties. So so loneliness really matters. That's why it makes sense to be speaking about it in a forum like this as well.
Well, the way you look at all this in a political sense, you get the feeling that Margaret Thatcher is not your biggest friend, and that you have a certain sympathy for Karl Marx, but also for the creator.
Well, I'd say a kind of in some ways.
Okay, so let's discuss this a little bit, because you're quoting Margaret Thatcher saying in 1981, so when the dark age of her hyper-capitalism started to unleash on Britain, that it was about that changing the heart and the soul was sort of her aim in terms of her reforms. It was it was not only a question of, the wallet. So that sounds like a very severe sort of way of influencing the individual in a society. Is that your criticism?
Well, I mean, the kind of capitalism that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan really promulgated, the neoliberal capitalism, this very dog eat dog, self-interested form of capitalism that they promulgated, but then actually got taken up across the globe, including in Austria and Germany and Switzerland as well. This form of capitalism, which was very much a me first, me focused form of capitalism, was not only about, wasn't only problematic in its economic outcomes. And, we know that, we've witnessed over the past few decades growing gaps between the rich and the poor, growing wealth gaps, growing income gaps. So it didn't only promulgate those kind of divides, but also perpetuated a mindset that valorized qualities like competitiveness, like ruthlessness, like self-interest, at the expense of qualities like caring for others, compassion, community, pro-community. And as such, it was inevitable in many ways that was going to lead to a world in which people did feel increasingly atomized, isolated, and lonely. And in a world in which they felt, well, if I don't look out for myself, who will? Because who will? Society? No, society's all I focus. The market, hardly. Government, unlikely, especially, of course, since 2008 and the financial crisis, when governments imposed austerity programs across most of the world. So that kind of capitalism is a big, is the other kind of key reason, I believe, that we've ended up where we have, with increasing numbers of people feeling lonely, feeling marginalized, feeling invisible.
From your research, could you see a difference between the UK and the US and the European continent, countries like Germany or Austria, where we generally have not such a hard-cut capitalist attitude, where the welfare state and the healthcare systems are usually still a little bit stronger?
Yes, although the UK has a pretty decent healthcare system still.
Yes. Fortunately, because people, the Tory governments didn't get to cut as much as they wanted. They were just about to begin when the pandemic hit and people realized how important this is to have one like that, right?
Yes. There are of course differences, but there are similarities. I mean, even though, so in terms of kind of the overarching ideology in neoliberal capitalism, I think it is fair to say that by and large that was embraced by Germany and Austria and Switzerland as well. If you look at things like decline of trade unions, that's something that we see in those countries as well as in the United Kingdom and the US, kind of decline of people going to church, So there are some of these kind of trends that I think are the same, in terms, and then of course austerity, a chosen response to the 2008 financial crisis across, continental Europe as well. So maybe some kind of, some differences, but actually when you dig into it, not as big differences, the kind of pre-1980s, you could really talk very meaningfully about a continental form of capitalism, a German form of capitalism. And, and I'd say, over the next few decades, we kind of increasingly saw, yes, less far perhaps on the spectrum, but still definitely no longer, I think, really that collectivist form of capitalism. And studies that have been done of, how whether countries are individualistic or collectivist, recent studies I just checked most recent kind of data before this events, and Austria, Switzerland and Germany all firmly in the individualistic rather than collectivist mindset camp now.
And is this changing through the pandemic? Because I think, you know, if we look at our British example here, suddenly Boris Johnson is introducing the most social democratic budgetary proposals and measures in order to keep people from falling into acute poverty, and millions of people are falling into acute poverty. Is this a sort of new social democratic age coming out of the pandemic, which also will be more able to tackle loneliness than what we had before?
I mean, that would be, you know, that would be a positive, a silver lining, if that were to be manifest. And you're absolutely right. You know, so far that's been the messaging here in the UK. Whether you know, we have a leader who's big on rhetoric. So let's see how the reality kind of pans out post pandemic. But it was something that, interestingly, you know, we saw across the globe, even before the pandemic, when it came to right-wing populists, and I would put Boris Johnson in that camp. So, you know, whether it was Trump or Marine Le Pen or Donald Trump, you know, they were clearly speaking to, and in their rhetoric at least, you know, saying that, you know, I am speaking to the forgotten people, you, the kind of workers, the working class man, I'm speaking to you, I recognize your pain. So that was something we were already seeing, kind of right-wing politicians who, you know, typically this wouldn't have been their space, taking, you know, speaking along those lines even before the pandemic. And, you know, my hope is that post-pandemic, you know, as we come out of months and months of having collectively been through this crisis, collectively mourned, collectively struggled, collectively experienced this, my hope would be that out of this we would see a more progressive politics in which social justice was more reconnected to the economy. And historically, we have seen, you know, crises deliver that, whether it was President Roosevelt's New Deal agenda in the United States in the wake of the Great Depression, which was where he, you know, really used that moment as a moment to strengthen worker rights, to invest in public art, public works, to create jobs, or whether it was in the United Kingdom, which after World War II founded the National Health Service. We do historically have these kind of moments of collective suffering, periods of collective suffering, leading to some sort of more equitable social contract. But, you know, it's not necessarily going to be the case.
Well, it's also very costly. So they'll have to see what they think. But if you look at
people have to acknowledge, you know, that there are trade-offs that they will need to make if that's the sort of, at an individual level, at a business level, you know, if that's the sort of society that we want. Because, yeah, I mean, some people will have to pay for it ultimately. Yeah, for sure.
But if you look at it concretely, for example, the British government, Theresa May put a minister for loneliness in place like 3 years back. And this was the first time. Usually people don't have a state secretary for loneliness. Did she actually do anything? Because I can imagine that's quite difficult if you're coming in as a state secretary, minister for loneliness, you get 10 million pounds. And then, as you write in your book, you're then able to make a kind of lectures or workshops for men to cook together or knit together or something like that, in order to bring some kind of social warmth into their life. Is that what happened, or do we look at something that governments in these narrow departments can actually do, which will make a fundamental change?
So I actually don't think the solution is to have a kind of underfunded, relatively junior ministerial position, which doesn't really have clout or voice, being charged with alleviating loneliness. Because Well, because so many of its drivers are structural, that they are inexorably linked to economic choices, political choices, choices around distribution, choices around where public funding is put. In the United Kingdom, we've seen massive defunding since 2008 of public libraries, of public parks, of youth clubs, of elderly daycare centres, of community centres, physical spaces where people can come together. So these are all, it entails better regulating social media companies. So, so having a minister without much clout or budget is not going to really solve the problem. At best, it will put a sticking plaster on what is, a much more substantial problem. And when I met with the, I've obviously met with on Zoom, of course, nowadays, with the current Minister of Loneliness, but with the previous Minister of Loneliness, when I was writing my book, I don't want to minimize the projects which they are putting money into, because they actually are useful and important and can help people feel more connected. They're typically investing in these community type initiatives, and that's good, because those initiatives will find it very hard to find funding elsewhere. So I don't want to minimize that, but that can't be all that they do. And and I was struck actually in my meeting with the previous minister, that even though, for example, she told me how smartphones she saw were part of the problem, but she felt that that was something which we as individuals had to address and change our own behavior on. She couldn't even see that there might be a government role to play there, and in many ways, social media companies are the tobacco companies of the 21st century, and they need to be regulated as such, especially when it comes to children. It's really hard when you're addicted to something to stop using it. So I think a Minister of Loneliness, Japan's interestingly just announced that they're also going to have a Minister of Loneliness. But I don't think that is the solution. It can be part of the solution, but not if everything's put on their shoulders and they have limited resources.
So in terms of, let's attack Facebook a little bit, that we also allow for use, also to promote our own talks. Like today, we're even on Facebook Live. So there are positive things, but what are the things that you would say governments need to do in order to tackle the problem that this enormous power these companies have, like, as you say, the tobacco companies had in the 80s and 90s?
Well, I think when it comes to children, I think that's where the regulator really should go in very strongly. When children as young as 9 are forging their identities on the basis of how many likes they're getting, there is a real problem, and it's a ticking time bomb. So I think when it comes to children, I would go as far as to say that addictive social media should be banned for children, putting the onus then on social media companies to come up with products which are less addictive, which aren't kind of rewarding you with that dopamine rush every time you get a retweet or a like. When it comes to hate and abuse and bullying on the platforms, I mean, clearly the platforms are not doing enough, where it's clear. We've seen very significant rise in cyberbullying during the pandemic, for example, and let alone increases in hate speech and things like that. And the platforms clearly are not doing enough on that front. So we need meaningful fines. We need a duty of care on social media companies, as has been put on them in Australia and as is being considered in the UK under a bill that's currently being considered, whereby, for example, they are held responsible for the psychological harm engendered by material on their platforms. So, there's a number of things governments can meaningfully do to intervene, for sure.
Yeah. One of the other big issues that you describe in the book, and where you already said the word, is libraries, urban planning, that we have to go not only on the digital space, find healthy solutions, but also in the actual space. So for a while, libraries were closing all over the place because people stopped reading actual books. Or if they read them often electronically and so forth. But the real reason why we need them is not that people read necessarily books, but that people actually meet other people, and that we have a social space in city centers, in village towns centers, where people have the chance to have human contact, which reduces loneliness, obviously. So what would you say should be done in terms of urban planning?
Well, yeah, I mean, libraries is a kind of no-brainer, and it's actually you would have thought it's actually it would be a pretty popular political platform piece without actually costing that much. Yet it's astounding the extent to which library funding in most countries has been dramatically slashed in recent years. Although I was looking at Austrian data, and I'm not sure the situation has been as bad in Austria, as far as I understand. So that's good news for the Austrians who are watching right now. But in Chicago, for example, they had a lovely initiative at a local government level where the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, funded 3 new public housing blocks with branches of Chicago Public Library in the ground floor. I love that scheme. A physical place for people to come together, because of course libraries aren't just about borrowing books. They often provide internet to people who might otherwise not have internet. They provide book clubs, reading, so they're kind of communal spaces. And so these blocks which have these libraries in the ground floor, which I love, because also a way of bringing people of different socioeconomic backgrounds to those spaces who might otherwise not be there. So it gives them an incentive to be there. It's not, of course, just government that has a role to play, though, when it comes to providing spaces for us to physically be together. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, as you know, Tessa, is one of my concerns is this general trend to a more contactless existence that we've seen even before the pandemic. So even before the pandemic, we were seeing a rise in people ordering their food from a online delivery hub rather than going to a cafe, people ordering their groceries online rather than going to a supermarket, people doing their yoga classes on YouTube. But what we've seen over the past year is a massive acceleration of that. Of course, many of us didn't have a choice. If we wanted to get things or do a class, we had to do it that way. But not only is doing things with others a way to mitigate our own loneliness, importantly, the skills that we practice when we do things together are in many ways the fundamental underpinnings of what we might think of as inclusive democracy. If you think about it, even just being in a yoga class in a room and thinking about where you put your mat and being conscious not to downward dog right in front of someone else's face. Those are moments when we're thinking about others, when we're navigating others' concerns, where we're being reciprocal, where we're being civil. And the danger is, of course, that if we don't have physical spaces to come together, and if we move to a world that's increasingly contactless, we also don't have the opportunity to keep practicing those skills. And that concerns me.
But that means also to find, as a government, favorable conditions for companies that are opening or that are trying to still exist after this pandemic to reopen. So yoga studios, but also coffee shops in the end, restaurants that are struggling.
Definitely. I mean, our local cafes, our local stores, these are places which, our local bookshops, these are places that anchor our communities, that nurture us. And even just a 30-second exchange in a cafe, in a bookshop, researchers have found that even such a short exchange helps, these micro exchanges help us feel more connected to each other. So these spaces are really important in alleviating loneliness and also providing us with these opportunities to practice democracy, so to speak. So yes, governments, especially now, really need to think hard about how they are going to help our local high streets get through these next few months, moving forward for sure. Sorry,
I'm just a little bit conscious of the time.
Okay, sure.
I wanted to call on people to please come up with questions if you have any to ask us, because we can talk for hours here among the two of us, of course, but it would be nice to hear also from someone in the auditorium. But just let's come to one of the chapters to finish up our talk à deux, which is, you know, we can spend a lot of money of governments in, we are not sitting in, unfortunately, to make these decisions. But what can governments do to make smart investment decisions in artificial intelligence? Because this is one of these sectors that you describe for a lot also in your book, where on the one hand, a lot of help can come from robots in pandemic times especially, but also as helpers. You say you almost developed the human relationship with your Alexa. So these things can be helpers, but they can also be, of course, the danger that in the end there's no human souls in all these robots. So how do we balance this in order to battle loneliness?
So I am excited about the role that technology can play. I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-technology. So I am excited about the role that technology can play in alleviating loneliness. And I was inspired by some things that I've witnessed. You know, you're right, Tessa, I write about in the book how attached I became to my Alexa, you know, those Amazon devices, virtual assistants you may have. So it's definitely possible to become attached to an inanimate object. And in Japan, where we see robot companions and robot carers really having been taken up in significant numbers in recent years, you know, there are actually quite heartwarming stories of elderly women knitting bonnets for their robot carers. There is one AI robot, social robot company, LEQ, which has a robot with a kind of round head and a triangular base. They shipped thousands of these to the United States, to Florida during the pandemic. And the stories of elderly Floridians saying, I would have felt so alone during lockdown had I not had my LEQ for company. So, you know, on the one hand, this is quite amazing that robots might be able to provide a sense of companionship to people who feel lonely, and that's on the one hand, that's a good thing. My concern is that, you know, we use this as an excuse to subcontract care and compassion to our robots, that or that we choose to hang out with our robots rather than our fellow humans, and thereby don't practice, thereby kind of no longer care about each other. So I see robots as the potential robots offerers in many ways throwing down the gauntlet to us as humans. How can we be more human than these robots who are becoming and inevitably going to become ever more sophisticated, ever more intelligent, ever more emotionally intelligent? We need to push ourselves, I think, to always outperform our robots on those fronts.
Yeah, and also use it maybe as, you know, if a robot can take over cleaning the toilets, which then gives us more time to actually talk to the people we care for or partly care for. That would make sense, you know, if you can have the luxury of conversations instead of actually care work that robots could possibly do in certain aspects.
Yes, that as well. But yes, yes, although it's kind of, there is something, and even though I encourage it and I feel enthusiastic about it, you know, it does make me feel a bit sad, the thought that you know, a robot kind of being the only person like stroking an elderly person's arm or something.
You know, but I mean exactly that. If you have someone doing the hard work that you don't want to do, wash the dishes and all this, clean the bathrooms, and then you have the time to sit actually with family members that might need emotional care and give that. I mean, the luxury of having the time for that. If I see how people, friends of mine with elderly parents, for example, struggle with getting it all done, and you know, we have usually no robots so far, not in Austria and not here, that are running around, except maybe things in the garden that the people have these little robots to cut the grass, but the general public still doesn't have robots. So to have robot help in the near future, which is possibly around the corner, I think, right, would make sense if it can be the sort of work that we don't want to do, but that would give us more.
Yeah, although even, you know, telling a joke, having a, you know, being a friend, just I think is okay as well, as long as we don't then hand over all our responsibility on that front. That's the danger. Yeah.
Let's see if we have questions. Jutta, how are we doing?
We have 2 questions. The first one is on Zoom by Felix Macard, and I will just read it to you. It says, addiction is increasingly understood as a form of disconnection. Have you encountered experiments or practices which attempt to tackle loneliness in a way similar to the way alcohol or drug addictions are?
That's a really interesting question. So, you know, some of these successes, of course, some of the big successes historically in treating addiction and alcoholism have been, of course, through 12-step programs which are really about people coming and sitting in rooms together and sharing their stories and bonding as people and regularly meeting face to face. So, you know, and inevitably the cure for loneliness, you know, is going to be needs to be in the large part, people physically coming together, people physically doing things together. In South Korea, there's a lovely scheme, private initiative, whereby there are daytime discos for elderly people. And thousands of South Koreans come by day and dance in the day in these daytime discos. But again, speaking to this recognition that firstly, people actually do want to be doing things face to face, which I'm sure after a year of lockdown, you know, we're all craving, but also that's a way of helping alleviate loneliness. So I think that's maybe a similar finding from the treatment of addiction and alcohol, that getting people in a room together, sharing, being respectful of each other, listening to each other, communicating, goes a really long way.
Felix Marquardt, by the way, is at the moment in Paris, if I'm correctly informed, or did you go back to Stockholm? And he's the author of the upcoming book of The Modern Nomad, which is about, I think, also quite personal story of being constantly on the move in a professional, but also in a personal way, which I'm very much looking forward to when it's published, and which we hope we can bring also on the Philoxenia talk here at the Kreisky Forum.
That's actually just to speak to that, because one of the things, you know, I think I very much saw myself, I lived a pretty global nomad life too, pre-pandemic, you know, on a plane every few weeks and traveling across the globe, and very much seeing myself as a global citizen. And one of the things when I was researching my book that became increasingly clear to me, and something that I'd never really thought about, was how important my local community was and my local neighborhood. And here I was, somebody who really saw myself as a global citizen, who perhaps hadn't tended my local neighborhood and my local community enough. And it was something that I realized as I was writing the book, and, you know, realized, you know, that I wasn't stopping and exchanging a few words with the postman, and I wasn't stopping and saying hello to the neighbor, and I was just busy and flying and stuff. And of course, after a year of being forced to be only in my local neighborhood, that really came home even more. That, you know, so it's interesting how this book has made me really acknowledge the value of the local in a way that I really hadn't before. But I'm fascinated to read your book, Felix, so I look forward to reading it too.
There is another question on Facebook, and it says, we are in an age of individualism. What can be done and how could it be done to reduce anger and violence in our society if we can't forge our personalities in direct exchange?
Okay, so you're absolutely right. This is an age of individualism, and we've seen rising levels of individualism really alongside the rise of neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism in the 80s. You even see this in pop song lyrics, which since the 1980s, we see words like we, us, and our steadily supplanted by words like I, me, and my. So yes, definitely a more individualistic society that we've already discussed inevitably was going to make people feel more disconnected from each other and lonelier. I was really inspired in my book in terms of what can be done about it. I was really inspired in my research about the initiatives that are being done across the world in terms of getting people to do things with others. You know, sometimes it was at a very small kind of local level. In Bristol, there's a scheme whereby people of all different nationalities would meet up and cook together. And through the cooking together, they would share their experiences, their history, their heritage. So you'd have, I don't know, a Scottish woman kind of baking shortbreads and an Ethiopian woman doing injera. So, you know, a real spread of people sharing their customs, so people doing things together at that level, but also things, of course, that governments can get involved with and play a role in, you know, whether it's civic service, compulsory civic service. I know some of the people on this Zoom may be in countries which already have some sort of national service or military service, but civic service where teenagers, for example, do things of voluntary work, community type work together. These are ways of bringing different people together. But it's also about us, of course, as individuals, if we want to feel more connected with others, thinking also about, you know, what can we do with others? And sometimes it's really as simple as thinking about what's going on in your own community. There may well be community events, things taking place that you haven't been attending. Maybe it's about just starting to show up at some of those. So I think it's about whether it's governments or private initiatives, or us as individuals thinking very consciously about how we can do things with other people. And also speak directly to your individualism point, what can we do for other people? Because doing things for others, volunteering, is a way that we can feel more connected to each other, as well as doing something for them. So there is a self-interested reason for doing this. And it's also a way of being healthier, because volunteering, people who help others, it turns out, live longer lives on average than people who don't. So you know, that's another thing we can think about to counter individualism. And again, there's a role that governments can play in facilitating and supporting more volunteering. And of course, employers have a role that they can play there too.
It's actually, you know, you mentioned in your book one of the initiatives that I thought was very interesting to me when it happened in Germany, and it also happened in Austria, which is less connected to helping people, but also to helping people understand the other side, because we have become so polarized through all these Facebook echo chambers that people have this huge problem to even listen to the other side. And we see this now, of course, where everyone is already so tired and going slightly crazy because of the lockdowns, that it even becomes more and more difficult to talk to. If someone who is for vaccination talks to someone who is not for vaccinations, you're ready to hit them over the head with a bottle before they even started to say why they don't want to take the vaccine, just because you think it's just so silly not to take a vaccine in order to protect other people, and so on and so forth. And you describe in your book this initiative that die Zeit started, Deutschland spricht, a few years back, which in Austria, the Standard also called for, where people just sat down for 2 hours with someone and they were matched with someone of the complete opposite political opinion. And what were the findings in this?
What I found, there was a brilliant initiative, and 40,000 people in Germany met up all over the country, and in beer gardens, in cafes, and the researchers, with people with very different views, anti-immigrant believers with refugee, asylum seekers, CEOs with trade unionists, are really different. And the findings were really fantastic. Just 2-hour encounter meant that that both sides felt that they saw the other person much less as the other, but much more as somebody like them, were much more aware of their shared concerns, often around family, were much more willing, they said, to invite someone like them into their social setting, and also, really fascinatingly, trusted Germans in general more, having done the experiments, than not having done it. So initiatives where different people come together, I think, are really critical in not only making us feel less lonely, but also helping us to reconnect at a societal level and bridge these kind of fissures and fractures that we've seen increasingly gape in recent years.
What do you mean they trusted Germans more? They were Germans.
So when they were asked the question before they did the experiment, how much do you trust Germans, like your fellow citizens? And then they were asked the question after they trusted just, your fellow citizens rather than specific people, their level of trust in German citizens in general went up. Yeah.
Jutta, do we have more questions? We have 3 minutes left.
We have Alexander Raditzner asks, what about military and civilian service for young people and fit pensioners? What does Noreena Hertz think about this as an idea? And sorry, short comment to the audience. Someone asked if they can actually say a word. Yes, you can. You have to virtually raise your hand. You can do it on Zoom, and then I can unmute you. Sorry.
So it was the question about military and civic service, but something about pensioners as well?
For fit pensioners and young people.
Putting them together.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, yeah. So I think civic service is a really, is definitely could play a really significant role with young people having to live together, do things together, do voluntary work. President Macron piloted a scheme like that in 2019, which obviously has been put on hold during the pandemic, but I think that is a really good idea. And more intergenerational stuff for sure. I mean, again, one of those win-wins where the two different groups learn from each other, and where you learn from each other, and places where this has been piloted, and co-living spaces with different generations have had really, really successful results and outcomes. So yeah, definitely should be in the menu of things to do.
Great. So Felix Markert has risen his hand. I will unmute him. Now you should be able to talk.
Wow, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Hi.
Thank you so much. Hi, Tessa. Good to see you. Noreena, wonderful to hear about this book.
Thank you.
We share the same agent, so I was actually going to ask you I wanted to send you my book, so I'm very pleased that we meet here. But yeah, I just wanted to go back to this idea of connection and addiction, and what you were saying about your experience of high entropy, high speed movement, and how the pandemic actually allowed you to connect with people around you that you were no longer connecting with because you were in the whirlwind of global travel. And I think one of the things that goes with this age of solitude is this very caricatural understanding of what nomadism is. Because nomadism, our age, which is obsessed with high-speed mobility, has turned the word nomadism into, first and foremost, meaning movement. But actually, nomadism is fundamentally about connection. So people who have a house in Bali and a chalet in Gstaad and a loft in Soho are not nomads. And I think this is one of the things, one of the virtues, certainly of what I understand from your book, is to show us actually what the real meaning, the real importance of these small connections that we can make on a daily basis. And that, yeah, a lot of this, this idea of the global, this like wrong ideas about the global have made us forget that if we're not local creatures, we're not anything. So yeah, I just I wanted to emphasize that and come back.
Thank you. Yes, these you know, and of course we can have these meaningful exchanges on our global journeys as well. But part of speaking to the speed, you know, many of us increasingly revved up the speed of our lives so that we were having increasingly few interactions. You know, headphones on, head in our phones, rushing by, and not just stopping to have that 30-second conversation that can make a huge difference.
And well, 2-hour conversation.
This is definitely a 2-hour conversation, which we should have the next time, because we finished our hour. And in order to bring us all back now to an analog place and have dinners with our family members, I would say we wrap it up here. Please buy Noreena's book, which is out from today in German. It's out in 16 languages in these months. So it's an incredible success story that you produced there, Noreena. And in Germany and in Austria and Switzerland, it's out from today, available on all your usual local bookstores that you can often not enter now, but where you can go and order books. My next Philoxenia talk is on the 9th of April with the wonderful British-Turkish author Elif Shafak. I'm looking very much forward to this, and I hope you all come, including previous guests like Noreena, and we can have a discussion on a few more topics, how we get out of this pandemic with a sane mind in order to engage with more social contacts and also have intellectual oxygen filling our brains again, which we all need after 1 year in lockdown. It's at 8 o'clock tonight that we should all go on our doorstep. At least the British government is asking us to come out with a candle in order to mark the anniversary of 1 year hard lockdown in Britain. And so many lives lost also to this terrible pandemic. Let's hope that governments start being responsible after they read Noreena's book and start implementing a few of your proposals. I want to thank you, Noreena, especially for coming on tonight. I want to thank also the Kreisky Forum, Jutta, our tech queen, and Gertrud Auer for organizing all of us in this beautiful way. And I hope I see you all very soon and also very much in person. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.